On a frozen trail in the dead of winter, a struggling cowboy pulls an unconscious woman from a snowdrift, never asking her name, never expecting anything in return. But when a letter arrives 2 weeks later, revealing she owns the largest cattle empire in the territory, his act of kindness becomes the key to a future he never dared to dream of. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The wind screamed through Widow's Pass like a wounded animal, tearing across the narrow trail that snaked between towering pines and sheer rock faces. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, turning the world into nothing but white noise and cold. Jesse Dalton hunched forward in his saddle, one gloved hand gripping the reins, the other holding his coat collar tight against his neck. His horse, an old roan mare named Dust, picked her way carefully through the drifts, ears pinned back against the storm. Behind him, wrapped in a wool blanket and strapped securely to the saddle, 8-year-old Tommy fought to keep his eyes open. His small face was buried in his father's back, arms locked around Jesse's waist. The boy hadn't complained once, not about the cold, not about the long ride home from Stillwater. He knew better. Winter in Red Bluff territory didn't care about complaints. Jesse had spent 14 hours at Harlow's stable, shoeing horses and mending broken wagon axles for travelers passing through. His hands still ached from the work, knuckles cracked and raw despite the leather gloves. The pay wasn't much, but it kept food on the table and firewood stacked by the cabin door. That was enough. It had to be. They were less than 3 miles from home when Jesse saw it. A dark shape slumped against the base of a wind-twisted pine just off the trail. At first, he thought it was a fallen branch or maybe a deer carcass left by wolves. But as dusk drew closer, the shape took form. A horse. Black as midnight, legs folded beneath it, head drooped low, and beside it, half buried in the snow, a figure in a long coat. Jesse reined Dust to a halt. His gut tightened. "Stay put, Tommy," he said quietly, swinging down from the saddle. The boy nodded, clutching the blanket tighter. Jesse approached slowly, boots crunching through the snow. The horse lifted its head weakly, steam rising from its nostrils. Exhausted, but alive. The person beside it wasn't moving. Jesse dropped to one knee, brushing snow from a shoulder, a face, a woman. Her lips were pale blue, skin like wax, eyes closed. Ice clung to her dark hair, and her breathing was so shallow he almost missed it. "Ma'am," Jesse said, voice firm but gentle. He shook her shoulder. Nothing. He pulled off his glove, pressed 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse. Faint, but there. He didn't hesitate, didn't wonder who she was or how she'd ended up out here alone. Didn't think about the storm or the miles still between them and shelter. He just moved. Scooping her up in his arms, he carried her back to Dust, who snorted nervously but held steady. Jesse shifted Tommy forward in the saddle, then carefully positioned the woman behind the boy, draping her limp arms around Tommy's waist. "Hold her hands, son," Jesse said. "Don't let go." Tommy's eyes were wide, scared, but he nodded and gripped the woman's frozen fingers in his own small ones. Jesse climbed up in front of them both, took the reins, and kicked Dust into motion. The black horse whinnied once, then staggered to its feet and followed behind, too tired to run, too loyal to be left. The wind howled louder, the snow came faster. Jesse's jaw clenched as he urged Dust forward, every step deliberate, every breath a fight. He could feel the woman's weight slumping heavier against Tommy's back. She was slipping away, and he knew it. "Almost there," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the boy, the horse, or himself. His cabin was close now, just over the next ridge, just a little further. The world had gone silent except for the crunch of hooves and the rasp of his own breathing. In his arms, in his care, was a stranger whose name he didn't know, and Jesse Dalton a man who had nothing to give but his own 2 hands, rode harder into the storm. Jesse didn't stop until he saw the outline of his cabin breaking through the wall of white. It wasn't much to look at. A single-room structure built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a slanted roof that barely kept the snow from piling through. But right now, it looked like salvation. He dismounted quickly, his boots sinking deep into the snow. Tommy was shivering now, his lips pressed tight, trying to be brave. Jesse reached up and carefully pulled the woman down from the saddle, cradling her against his chest. She was heavier than he expected. Dead weight in his arms, her head lolling to one side. Her breathing was so faint, he had to press his ear close to her mouth, just to be sure it was still there. "Tommy, get the door," Jesse said, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. The boy slid down from the saddle and ran ahead, fumbling with the latch. The door swung open with a groan, and a gust of warm air spilled out into the cold. Jesse carried the woman inside and laid her gently on the narrow cot near the fireplace. The embers were still glowing faintly from the morning fire, and he wasted no time throwing 2 fresh logs onto the coals, stirring them until flames licked up hungrily. "Tommy, grab every blanket we got," Jesse said, already kneeling beside the woman. He pulled off her soaked coat, heavy with ice and snow, then her boots. Her feet were pale, almost gray. Frostbite was settling in. He worked quickly, wrapping her legs in a thick quilt, tucking another around her shoulders. Tommy came back with an armful of wool blankets and a patchwork quilt his mother had made years ago, before the fever took her. Jesse draped them all over the woman, layering them carefully, then moved to the small stove in the corner. He filled a dented kettle with water from the bucket and set it to boil. His hands were shaking now, not from the cold, but from something else. Fear, maybe. Responsibility. He'd pulled people out of trouble before, helped a neighbor with a broken wagon axle, or carried an injured man back to town after a bar fight. But this was different. This woman was hanging by a thread, and if she didn't make it, it would be on him. "Is she gonna die, Pa?" Tommy's voice was small, barely above a whisper. Jesse looked over his shoulder at his son, standing there with snow still melting in his hair, eyes wide and scared. He wanted to lie, to tell the boy everything would be fine. But he'd never lied to Tommy before, and he wasn't about to start now. "I don't know," Jesse said quietly, "but we're going to do everything we can." He poured hot water into a tin cup, added a pinch of dried mint from a jar on the shelf, and knelt beside the cot again. Lifting the woman's head gently, he pressed the rim of the cup to her lips. Most of it dribbled down her chin, but a few drops made it past her lips. Her throat moved just barely. "That's it," Jesse murmured. "Come on now, stay with us." He set the cup down and rubbed her hands between his own, trying to coax warmth back into her fingers. They were like ice, stiff and unresponsive. He worked in silence, methodical, focused. Tommy crept closer, watching. "Can I help?" the boy asked. Jesse nodded. "Stoke the fire. Keep it hot." Tommy moved to the hearth, carefully adding kindling, his small hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. The flames grew brighter, casting long shadows across the walls. The cabin filled with warmth, and slowly, painfully slowly, color began to seep back into the woman's face. Her eyelids fluttered, once, twice. Then her lips parted, and a soft, broken sound escaped her throat. Not words, just breath, but it was enough. Jesse exhaled, a weight lifting from his chest. She was still here, still fighting. He sat back on his heels, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand, and glanced at Tommy. The boy was watching him with something like awe. "You did good, son," Jesse said quietly. Tommy smiled, just a little. "So did you, Pi." The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with a warmth that felt almost sacred after the brutal cold outside. Jesse sat in the wooden chair by the hearth, elbows resting on his knees, watching the woman on the cot. Her breathing had steadied, deeper now, more certain. The color had returned to her cheeks, faint but present, like the first blush of dawn over the mountains. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor near the stove, stirring a pot of beans and salt pork that bubbled over the heat. He'd added a little water to stretch it further, the way his father had taught him. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and that mattered more than flavor tonight. Jesse hadn't moved much in the last hour. He'd checked the woman's pulse twice, adjusted the blankets around her shoulders, made sure her feet were elevated and wrapped. Now he just waited, hands folded, eyes tired but alert. He didn't know who she was, didn't know where she'd come from or why she'd been out on Widow's Pass alone in the middle of a blizzard. And truthfully, it didn't matter. She was here. She was alive. That was enough. The woman stirred. A soft groan escaped her lips, and her head turned slightly on the thin pillow. Jessie sat up straighter, leaning forward. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, revealing sharp gray eyes that blinked in confusion at the unfamiliar ceiling above her. "Easy now," Jesse said, his voice low and calm. "You're safe." Her gaze shifted to him, wide and disoriented. She tried to sit up, but her body didn't cooperate. Jesse reached out gently, a hand hovering but not touching. "Don't push it. You've been out cold for a while, nearly froze to death." She stared at him, lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the rough log walls, the stone fireplace, the boy stirring a pot in the corner. Then back to Jesse. "Where?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Copper Creek," Jesse said. "Few miles south of Stillwater. Found you on the trail, half buried in snow. Brought you here." She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, as if trying to piece together how she'd ended up in this place. When she opened them again, there was something sharper in her gaze. Not fear. Recognition, maybe, or disbelief. "My horse," she said suddenly, trying to sit up again. "She's in the lean-to out back," Jesse replied. "Fed her, rubbed her down. She'll be all right." The woman sank back against the pillow, relief flickering across her face. Then she looked at him again, really looked, studying the lines around his eyes, the worn fabric of his shirt, the calluses on his hands. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Jesse shrugged. "Didn't seem right to leave you out there." She was silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, almost to herself, she murmured, "Most people would have." Before Jesse could respond, Tommy appeared at the edge of the cot, holding a chipped bowl of beans in both hands. His eyes were wide with curiosity, but there was no fear in them, just the innocent wonder of a child meeting someone new. "Pa said you were real cold," Tommy said, offering the bowl. "This'll warm you up." The woman's gaze softened. She reached out slowly, taking the bowl with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. Tommy grinned. "You got a name?" "Tommy," Jesse said gently, a quiet reprimand. But the woman smiled, just faintly. "It's all right." She looked at the boy. "Kate, my name's Kate." Tommy nodded solemnly, as if committing it to memory. "I'm Tommy." "That's my pa, Jesse." Kate glanced at Jesse again, something shifting in her expression. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper. "Thank you, Jesse," she said softly, "for not leaving me out there." Jesse just nodded once, his face unreadable. "Eat up," he said. "You'll need your strength." And as the fire crackled and the storm outside began to fade, the three of them sat together in the quiet warmth of the cabin, strangers no longer. The night settled in around them, thick and quiet. Outside, the wind had finally stopped howling, leaving behind only the soft whisper of snow sliding off the roof. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts of old memories. Kate sat propped up on the cot now, the bowl of beans resting in her lap. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if each bite required concentration. Jesse had moved back to his chair, giving her space, while Tommy sat on the floor nearby, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife, his tongue poking out in concentration. Kate watched them both in silence, the man, broad-shouldered and weathered, his face carved by hard winters and harder work. The boy, small and serious, too grown up for his age in the way children become when life doesn't give them the luxury of innocence. There was something achingly familiar about this place, about the simplicity of it. It reminded her of something she'd lost a long time ago. "How long have you lived here?" Kate asked, breaking the silence. Jesse looked up. "Going on 6 years now. Built it myself after my wife passed." Kate's gaze softened. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, the gesture brief, practiced. "Tommy was just 2. Needed a place to raise him. This was all I could afford." "It's honest work," Kate said, glancing around the cabin. "Good work." Jesse's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something close to pride. "It keeps us fed, keeps us warm. That's all a man can ask for." Kate set the empty bowl down on the small table beside the cot. "You could ask for more." Jesse met her eyes, his expression unreadable. "Could. Don't see the point." There was a weight to his words, a quiet resignation that Kate recognized all too well. She'd seen it in the faces of men who worked her land, men who broke their backs for wages that barely stretched from one season to the next, men who'd stopped dreaming because dreaming hurt too much. "What were you doing out there?" Jesse asked, his voice gentler now. "On Widow's Pass in the middle of a storm?" Kate exhaled slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the quilt draped over her legs. "I was heading to Grand Pine Lodge. Had business there. My driver got sick 2 days ago, so I went alone. Thought I could make it before the storm hit." She paused, a bitter smile crossing her lips. "I was wrong." "That trail's no place for a woman alone," Jesse said, not unkindly. Kate's eyes flashed, just for a moment. "I've ridden worse trails than that. I know how to handle myself." Jesse raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "I'm sure you do. Still doesn't mean the mountain cares." She studied him again, longer this time. There was no condescension in his voice, no judgment, just a plain-spoken truth delivered without malice. It was rare, she realized, to meet someone who spoke without calculation, without an angle. "What do you do?" Tommy asked suddenly, looking up from his whittling. "For work, I mean." Kate hesitated. She could feel Jesse's gaze on her, patient but curious. "I run a ranch," she said carefully. "Cattle, mostly." Tommy's eyes lit up. "Like the big ones? With hundreds of head?" Kate smiled despite herself. "Something like that." "Must be nice," Jesse said quietly, leaning back in his chair. "Having land like that." There was no envy in his voice, no bitterness, just a quiet observation. Kate felt something twist in her chest. She thought of the sprawling estate in Silver Ridge, the endless pastures, the mansion with more rooms than she could ever use. And then she looked around this cabin, small and worn and filled with warmth, and realized which one felt more like home. "It has its challenges," she said softly. Jesse nodded, as if he understood more than she'd said. "Everything worth having does." Tommy yawned, his eyelids drooping. Jesse stood, scooped the boy up in his arms, and carried him to the small cot in the corner, tucking him in with practiced ease. Kate watched the tenderness in his movements, the way he brushed the hair from Tommy's forehead before turning back. "You should rest too," Jesse said. "Morning'll come quick." Kate nodded, pulling the blankets tighter around herself. "Thank you, Jesse, for everything." He just tipped his head, then moved to bank the fire for the night. And as the cabin settled into darkness, Kate closed her eyes, feeling safer than she had in years. Morning came cold and clear, the sky scrubbed clean by the storm. Sunlight poured through the frost-covered window, painting bright squares across the cabin floor. Jesse was already awake, pulling on his coat and boots near the door. He moved quietly, careful not to wake Tommy, who was still curled up beneath his blankets, snoring softly. Kate stirred on the cot, her eyes opening slowly. For a moment she seemed confused. Then memory returned and she sat up carefully, testing her body. The stiffness was still there, the ache in her bones, but the worst had passed. She was alive, and that was more than she'd expected yesterday. "Morning," Jesse said, glancing over. "How you feeling?" "Better," Kate replied, her voice still rough but stronger. "Much better." Jesse nodded. "Good. I'm going to check on your horse, make sure she's ready to ride. Storm's past. Roads should be clear enough by midday." Kate swung her legs off the cot, testing her weight. Her boots sat near the fire, dried and warmed. "I can help." "No need," Jesse said, already pulling on his gloves. "You just rest up." Before she could argue, he was out the door, letting in a sharp gust of cold air before closing it behind him. Kate stood slowly, steadying herself against the wall, then moved to the window. Through the frosted glass, she watched Jesse trudge through the snow toward the small lean-to behind the cabin. Tommy woke a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes and padding over to stand beside her. "He's always like that," the boy said matter-of-factly. "Always fixing things, even when nobody asks." Kate smiled. "Sounds like a good man." "Best man I know," Tommy said, with the absolute certainty only a child could muster. Outside, Jesse worked with quiet efficiency. He'd already fed Kate's horse, a fine black mare with good lines and expensive tack. Too expensive for someone traveling alone, he thought, but he didn't dwell on it. He checked her hooves, ran his hands along her legs, examined the saddle for damage. The leather was high quality, barely worn. Everything about this woman spoke of money, of a life far removed from his own. But she hadn't acted like it, hadn't looked down at his cabin or turned her nose up at the simple food. She'd said thank you like she meant it, like gratitude wasn't just a word, but something she felt in her bones. Jesse found a loose cinch strap and tightened it, then adjusted the stirrups. When he was satisfied the mare was sound, he led her around front and tied her to the porch rail. Kate was standing in the doorway now, wrapped in her coat, her color fully returned. "She's ready," Jesse said simply. "Should get you back to Stillwater without trouble." Kate stepped down off the porch, running a hand along the mare's neck. The horse nickered softly, nuzzling her shoulder. "You didn't have to do all this," she said quietly. Jesse shrugged. "Horse needed tending. Didn't make sense to send you off with loose tack." Kate turned to face him, her gray eyes searching his. Most men would have asked for payment, or at least expected it. "I'm not most men." She held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them. An understanding, maybe. A recognition of something rare in a world that often felt too hard, too transactional. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a folded bill. "Please," she said, "let me—" Jesse held up a hand, shaking his head. "Keep it. You'll need it more than me on the road." Kate's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to disbelief. She tucked the money back into her pocket slowly, then looked at Tommy, who'd come out to stand beside his father. "You take care of him," she said to the boy. Tommy nodded solemnly. "I always do." Kate mounted her horse with practiced grace, settling into the saddle. She looked down at Jesse one last time. "I won't forget this, Jesse Dalton." "Safe travels, Miss Kate," he said, tipping his hat. She turned the mare toward the trail, then paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "You're a good man. Better than you know." And then she was gone, riding toward the horizon, leaving nothing behind but hoofprints in the snow, and a question Jesse couldn't quite shake. Who was she, really? 3 weeks passed like water over stone, slow and steady. wearing away at the memory until it felt almost like a dream. The snow had melted in patches, leaving the ground muddy and raw, the earth breathing again after the long freeze. Spring wasn't here yet, but it was coming, creeping in on the edges of each day. Jesse's life returned to its familiar rhythm. Up before dawn, coffee boiled over the stove. Tommy dressed and fed before the walk into Stillwater. Work at Harlow's was steady, predictable. Horses needed shoeing, wagons needed fixing, and Jesse's hands knew the work without thinking. Hammer and anvil, leather and iron, the smell of hot metal and horse sweat filling his lungs. He didn't talk much about the woman he'd saved. A few folks in town had heard rumors. Someone passing through who'd seen the black mare tied to his porch that morning. Someone else who'd spotted a well-dressed woman riding out toward Silver Ridge. But Jesse offered no details, and people knew better than to press him. He wasn't the type to turn a good deed into a story. Still, there were moments. Quiet moments when he'd pause mid-swing at the anvil, or when he'd be walking home at dusk with Tommy chattering beside him, and he'd think of her, Kate, the way she'd looked at him with those sharp gray eyes, like she was seeing something most people missed. The way she'd thanked him, not with politeness, but with something real, something raw. He wondered if she'd made it to her destination, wondered if she thought about that night at all, or if it had already faded into the background noise of her life. Just another close call on a dangerous road. Tommy asked about her once, a week after she'd left. "You think we'll see Miss Kate again, Pa?" Jesse had been mending a bridle by lamplight, his hands working the leather with practiced ease. He didn't look up. "I doubt it, son. She's got her own life. We got ours." Tommy had nodded, accepting the answer the way children do when they trust their father's word completely. But Jesse had caught the flicker of disappointment in the boy's eyes, and it had settled in his chest like a stone. Life went on. Bills came. Bills were paid, barely. The roof started leaking again in the back corner, and Jesse patched it with tar and old shingles scavenged from a collapsed barn outside town. Tommy brought home a stray cat, orange and scrawny, and Jesse let him keep it despite the extra mouth to feed. The boy needed something to care for, something small and alive that depended on him. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, Tommy spoke up again. "Do you think she remembered us?" Jesse looked down at his son, at the way the fading light caught in his hair, the same color his mother's had been. "I think so," he said quietly, "but remembering and coming back are different things." Tommy frowned, thinking it over, but she said she wouldn't forget. "People say a lot of things, Tommy. Doesn't always mean they can keep them." The boy fell silent, leaning against his father's side. Jesse wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. The cat purred in Tommy's lap, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out to the coming night. Jesse told himself he didn't expect anything. Told himself that saving her life had been the right thing to do, and that was enough. He didn't need gratitude, didn't need recognition. He'd done what any decent man would do, and the world didn't owe him anything for it. But late at night, when the fire burned low and Tommy was asleep, Jesse would sometimes find himself staring at the door, wondering if she'd really meant it when she said she wouldn't forget, wondering if somewhere out there, in a world far bigger and wealthier than his own, she ever thought about the man who'd pulled her from the snow and asked for nothing in return. He told himself it didn't matter, but deep down, in a place he didn't often visit, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, it did. The writer came on a Thursday afternoon, just as Jesse was finishing up a wheel repair outside Harlow's. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything gold and amber, and the air still carried the bite of winter's last breath. Jesse was wiping his hands on a rag when he heard the hoofbeats, steady and purposeful, coming up the main road through Stillwater. He glanced up. A man in a clean suit and bowler hat sat astride a chestnut gelding, looking out of place among the dust and rough timber buildings. The stranger's eyes scanned the street until they landed on Jesse, and then he turned the horse directly toward him. "Jesse Dalton," the man called out. Jesse straightened, wariness creeping into his posture. Men in suits rarely brought good news. "That's me." The rider dismounted with practiced ease and reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "I've been instructed to deliver this to you personally. From Miss Catherine Merrick." Jesse's breath caught. Kate. He took the envelope slowly, turning it over in his hands. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind he'd never held before. The seal bore an ornate letter M pressed into the wax. "She asked me to wait for your response, if you're inclined to give one," the man added, tipping his hat. Jesse nodded absently, already breaking the seal. The wax cracked under his thumb, and he unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, each word deliberate. "Dear Jesse, I have thought about that night every day since I left your doorstep. About the way you didn't hesitate. About the way you looked at me not as a stranger, not as a burden, but simply as someone who needed help. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't ask what I could give you. You just acted, and in doing so, you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Decency isn't a transaction, it's a choice. My name is Catherine Merrick. I own the Merrick Cattle Company, the largest ranch operation in Red Bluff Territory. I built it from nothing after my father passed, and I've spent 15 years proving I could run it better than any man who doubted me. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why I started. I became cold, calculating, measuring every relationship by what it could gain me. You asked for nothing, you expected nothing, and yet you gave me everything." Jesse's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading. "I won't insult you with charity, but I would like to offer you something you've earned through your character, not your circumstance. I'm expanding operations into Copper Creek and need a foreman to oversee the new stable and livestock management. The position comes with a salary of $120 a month, housing on the property, and schooling provisions for Tommy. But more than that, I'm offering you a partnership, a chance to build something meaningful, not for me, but with me. I need someone I can trust, someone who sees people, not profit, someone like you. If you're willing, the job is yours." Jesse had to read the last part twice. His vision blurred slightly, and he blinked hard, forcing the words back into focus. $120 a month. More money than he'd ever seen in his life. Housing, schooling for Tommy, a future. He looked up at the rider, who stood patiently, hands folded in front of him. "She's serious about this?" "Miss Merrick doesn't make offers she doesn't intend to keep," the man replied. "She's waiting for your answer at the Silver Ridge estate. I can take you there now, if you'd like." Jesse folded the letter carefully, his throat tight. He thought about Tommy, about the leaking roof and the empty cupboards and the endless grind of barely making it through each month. He thought about Kate's eyes, the way she'd looked at him that morning like he was something more than just a poor cowboy scraping by. He thought about being seen, really seen. "Give me an hour," Jesse said, his voice rough. "I need to get my son." The rider smiled and tipped his hat again. "Take your time, Mr. Dalton. She's been waiting 3 weeks. An hour won't make a difference." Jesse stood on the porch of his cabin, the letter still clutched in his hand, staring out at the land he'd carved a life from with nothing but sweat and stubbornness. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Tommy sat beside him on the wooden step, the orange cat curled in his lap, purring softly. "Pa?" Tommy's voice was small, uncertain. "What's the letter say?" Jesse looked down at his son, at the wide eyes that held so much trust, so much hope. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to the boy's level, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You remember Miss Kate?" Jesse asked gently. Tommy nodded quickly. "The lady you saved." "That's right." Jesse took a breath. Turns out she owns the biggest ranch in the whole territory, and she's offering me a job. A real job, Tommy. Good pay, a proper house, and a school for you." Tommy's eyes went even wider. "A school? With books and everything?" Jesse's throat tightened. "With books and everything. Are we gonna say yes?" the boy asked, his voice climbing with excitement. Jesse felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a physical thing. All his life, he'd worked for scraps, for survival, for just enough to keep going one more day. He'd never asked for more because asking felt dangerous, like hoping for something you couldn't afford to lose. But here it was, offered freely, not because he'd begged for it, but because he'd done what was right when no one was watching. "Yes, son," Jesse said, his voice breaking just slightly. "I think we are." Tommy threw his arms around his father's neck, and Jesse held him tight, feeling the boy's small heartbeat against his chest. Tears stung his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, let himself feel the weight of years of struggle finally lifting, just a little. An hour later, Jesse and Tommy rode into Silver Ridge behind the suited rider. The Merrick estate sprawled before them like something out of a dream, vast pastures dotted with cattle, white fences stretching toward the horizon, and a grand house that caught the last light of day like a beacon. Kate stood on the wide porch, her hands clasped in front of her, watching them approach. She'd changed from trail clothes into a simple dress, her dark hair pulled back, but her eyes were the same, sharp, steady, real. Jesse dismounted and lifted Tommy down, then walked slowly toward her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, two people from different worlds who'd found something rare in each other: respect, recognition, truth. "You came," Kate said softly. "You asked," Jesse replied. A smile touched her lips, small but genuine. She looked down at Tommy, who was staring up at the house with wonder. "You must be Tommy." "Yes, ma'am," the boy said, remembering his manners. "There's a library inside," Kate said. 300 books. You're welcome to read any of them." Tommy looked up at his father, disbelief and joy warring on his face. Jesse nodded, and the boy took off running toward the house, the orange cat bounding after him. Kate turned back to Jesse. "I meant what I said in the letter. This isn't charity. You earned this." Jesse shook his head slowly. "I just did what anyone should have done. But most wouldn't have," Kate said quietly. "That's the difference. That's why you're here." Jesse looked out at the land, at the future spread before him, like a gift he'd never dared imagine. Then he looked back at Kate, at the woman who'd seen something in him worth investing in, worth believing in. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried everything he couldn't say. Gratitude, yes, but also hope. The kind of hope that doesn't break under the weight of the world. Kate extended her hand. "Partners?" Jesse took it, his calloused palm against hers, and nodded. "Partners." As the sun dipped below the mountains and the stars began to appear, two lives that should never have crossed paths became forever intertwined. A cowboy and a cattle queen, bound not by circumstance, but by the simple, enduring power of doing what's right. And in that moment, everything changed. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.